What's good, YouTube? It's your boy, Blue Blood Sports TV, back at y'all with another one. So, two-time welterweight world champion, superstar boxer, Showtime Shawn Porter, he weighs in on the longest reigning champion within the sport of boxing, that being WBC featherweight world champion, superstar boxer, Mr. Gary Russell Jr. And Shawn Porter says that Gary Russell, once upon a time, one day called him a few years ago, and he discussed his inactivity. And this was the topic of subject, is that Mr. Gary Russell Jr. is fighting once a year. His inactivity, it was the subject of topic. And so Shawn Porter, he stated that once upon a time, Mr. Gary Russell Jr. called him early in the morning, and he stated that he gave him a rundown of why he's inactive, okay? And he explained that Mr. Gary Russell Jr. is of the belief that he will not allow anybody to control or dictate what he does, how he does it, and when he does it. And Shawn Porter stated that, first things first, Mr. Gary Russell Jr. is 31-1, 18 by way of knockout. He's 32 years of age, and he's a featherweight. Okay, he's the longest reigning champion in the sport of boxing currently right now to today. The last time he fought was against Mbar, and that was February of 2020. And so with that said, you know, Mr. Gary Russell Jr. simply is just not active enough, okay? And due to the fact that he's not active, a lot of people have forgotten about him. He's a clear case of out of sight, out of mind, and it's unfortunate because the talent of Mr. Gary Russell Jr. So Gary Russell Jr. is an undoubtedly great talent. Fastest hands in the sport of boxing, high ring IQ, power, southpaw, you name it, he has it. He had a loss. One loss on his resume came at the hands of 3-division world champion, former lightweight unified world champion, former Olympic 2-time gold medalist, Vasily High-Tech Lomachenko. And Gary Russell explained that there was some technical difficulties as far as his weight went. They were mismanaging his weight due to a scale that was inaccurate. So Shawn Porter lets it be known that it's the mindset of Gary Russell Jr. within the sport of boxing that is leading him to only fight once a year, and it is leading him to inactivity, and essentially it's having a bad effect on his career. He's now 32 years of age, and he's fighting once a year, and it becomes a case of out of sight, out of mind. And me personally, I love Gary Russell Jr., but it's clearly becoming a case of out of sight, out of mind. And this is what Shawn Porter is alluding to when you talk about these guys in the lower weight classes. When you talk about Ryan Garcia, Gervonta Tank Davis, Devin Haney, Teofimo Lopez, Shakur Stevenson, when you make mention of these guys' name, Vasily Lomachenko still, Gary Russell's name gets left off, and you don't purposely do it. It's just out of sight, out of mind. It's inactivity, right? It's not repetitious. You don't see him. You don't hear him. He's not fighting. So it's essentially, it's like he's semi-retired, right? Until he's active. So let's listen to what Shawn Porter had to say regarding this. And Gary Russell Jr., he states that, you know, he has a lot of issues with dictators. And it's understandable, right? He don't want anybody to dictate when he fights, where he fights, who he fights. He wants to call the shots. He's the boss, right? So he states, Shawn Porter states that Gary Russell states that he has a, he has a manager. He has an advisor. He signed with the PBC, Premier Boxing Champions. He signed with advisor and founder Al Heyman. But Gary Russell Jr. feels like it's the powers that be that are keeping him from making the fights. And there's a lot of people within the sport of boxing that feels like Gary Russell Jr. is difficult to deal with. So there's a lot of talk that maybe Floyd Mayweather is, essentially preventing Gary Russell from landing these big fights. But let's just listen to what Shawn Porter had to say.
This conversation was 2, if not 3 years ago, is the same now as it was 2 or 3 years ago, where I am in control of my career. Yes, I have people on paper as my manager, but I am my manager. I'm like, all right, Gary, more power to you. He said, what you don't understand is I'm going to make more money than anybody in this sport. I'm like, all right, Gary, all power to you. He said, ain't nobody going to tell me what I want to do. Ain't nobody going to tell me who to fight or when to fight. I'm going to make all that happen myself. But that mindset has got him off of my paper.
Now, the paper Shawn Porter is saying off of my paper is that it was his list of these young guys. You know, he was talking about, you know, the young guys I just mentioned: Shakur Stevenson, Gervonta Tank Davis, Devin Haney, Ryan Garcia, Teofimo Lopez, and still Vasyl Lomachenko, and how they rank. And one of his co-hosts, they stated, "What about Gary Russell Jr.?" And Shawn Porter said, "You know what? I forgot about Gary Russell Jr." This is how this led into this. So this is why Shawn Porter is explaining why he was left off of his list. And he's giving an explanation as to Gary Russell simply is, you know, preventing himself. He's being his own robot.
Yeah. Like, damn. Like, how do I have 6 names, 6 guys, and you could virtually be better than everybody on this list, with the exception of Lomachenko, because
he's supposed to fight Gary Russell. February, he's supposed to fight.
So they're saying that Gary Russell Jr. is supposed to have a fight coming up in February. But if you go to BoxRec, or if you look, there's no real mention of when Gary Russell Jr. is going to fight again. So, you know, Gary Russell Jr., essentially Shawn Porter is attesting his inactivity and his lack of being able to secure the big fight is due to his own doing, because he's doing things his way, but it's just not working.
But it's not the fight we expect.
Yeah.
It's not the fight we want.
And it's coming up on, you know, he fought the year before that in February, and then the year before that it was May, and then it was...
So you see that Shawn Porter is essentially saying that Gary Russell Jr. wants to do things his way. But in the business of the sport of boxing, the business that this is preventing him from landing the big fights. And like Shawn Porter said, it's unfortunate because Gary Russell Jr. could very well be the best out of this crop of guys. He stated, with the exception of Lomachenko, because he already fought Lomachenko and he lost to Lomachenko, regardless of there is some technical difficulties on his side. But even Gary Russell Jr. himself, he states that, you know, he don't make up any excuses. So with that said, you know, Gary Russell Jr. should be in the mix. There was a lot of talk of Devin Haney fighting Gary Russell Jr., and that fell through. And it fell through because Gary Russell stated that, you know, they didn't properly send him over the proper contract. And, you know, there were some technical things he didn't like in the contract, so he didn't agree to it. But he should have sent out counter contracts, right? So this is essentially a direct explanation as to why he's not landing these big fights. Like Shawn Porter said, he's going to do things his way. Nobody's going to dictate who he fights, when he fights, and how he fights. And that's going to be an issue in the sport of boxing, because then they'll just party around you, right? They'll leave you out of their sandbox because there's enough players on the field to still allow the game to carry on without your talent. And there's enough talented players on the field to allow the game to continue on without your talent. See, and it's overshadowing your talent. Your inactivity is hindering your legacy, because you see, Ryan Garcia light is very bright. Shakur Stevenson light is very bright. Devin Haney's light is very bright. Teofimo Lopez light is very bright. Gervonta Tank Davis light is very bright. All of these guys light are bright, and they're dimming Gary Russell Jr.'s light, and he's allowing his light to be dimmed by not being active within the, you know, sport of boxing. Now, I agree. If he don't agree with the way things are run in the sport of boxing, who am I, or who is anybody else to tell him how he should do things? But at the end of the day, then you can't complain for being left out of the game, because they're simply going to, and is it correct? No, we see this happening to a number of boxers. Guillermo Rigondeaux, what they did to Guillermo Rigondeaux was an absolute travesty, to say the least. He wasn't allowed to play in any of the reindeer games and participate. Abner Mares, Leo Santa Cruz, Carl Frampton. He wasn't able to secure any of these fights after he defeated Nonito Donaire. He was left out in the cold. He got one big fight, and he wasn't successful, and that was against Lomachenko. So with that said, Gary Russell Jr. was in negotiations, I thought, with Devin Haney, and things went south because he wasn't in agreement with things, lettering and wording in the contract, and he stated that he was going to make a counter offer, but according to Devin Haney and his father, trainer and manager, Bill Haney, he never sent over the counter offer. So there's a lot of confusion going on when it comes to Gary Russell Jr. and his career, and there's a lot of blame being placed on Floyd Mayweather as well. Again, like I said, with Shawn Porter stating that Gary Russell Jr.'s mindset is that he's his boss and he's going to do things his way, and in return, what happens is they're going to blackball him out the sport of boxing, point blank and period. But that's all I got for y'all, man. Drop a comment in the comment section. Let me know what y'all think. Y'all already know what it is. It's your boy Blue, Blue Blood Sports TV. Hate, like, comment, and subscribe. If you haven't subscribed, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, hit the bell icon to get all the new notifications. Follow me on Instagram at Blue Blood Sports TV, all one word. Y'all already know what it is. Shout out to the entire LDBC. Shout out to New Media. Shout out to Black Media Row. Make sure you like and share these videos. That's all I got for y'all. Peace.